Up, up, up. Welcome to Vintage Garage. We have another full show today. First, we'll start the restoration of the Titan Mk9 Formula Ford. At the end of last season, we disassembled the car and had planned to take all the suspension links to Richmond to be nickel plated. When we got there, however, we found the shop out of business, so now we need to do it ourselves. In the first part of the show, we'll set up our nickel plate tanks and begin plating parts. After that, we'll take a field trip to Lincoln Speedway for the ARDC midget races. That should be a lot of fun. Lastly, we need to freshen up the motor in the Lola T492, and we'll pull the motor in the car to begin the job. So stay tuned, we have a lot to do this week. Glad you're here. We moved over to our plating bench now at Vintage Garage. This is where we do all our nickel plating on the parts that we put on cars that we're restoring. In this bucket we have what we call our pickle number 2. Essentially it's muriatic acid, that's hydrochloric acid, that's been diluted with distilled water. We use this bucket as the first treatment of parts that we're nickel plating that are steel and have never been plated before. It removes rust and sort of etches the metal and is a good starting point for the nickel plating. In the second bucket we have pickle number 3. This is a dilution of sulfuric acid. Essentially, it's 3 parts of battery acid to 1 part of distilled water. We have several different types of parts that we need to plate. For example, this upper control arm was originally nickel plated. We'll have to use pickle number 3 to strip the old nickel off that before we put fresh nickel plate on. We also have parts such as this steering column end with a spline on it that's never been nickel plated. In this case, we'll use pickle number 2 to treat the metal, remove any rust, and prepare it for nickel plating. Our third bucket over here contains our nickel plate solution. Here are the elements of what we have set up in this bucket. First we have our anode, which is a sheet of nickel that we just submerged in the solution. We also have an aquarium heater, and we've adjusted the temperature so that it's roughly 100 degrees. We have an aquarium thermometer that we can read the temperature on, and right now it's in the mid-90s and it should be a little warmer. So we'll set our temperature up just a little bit. We also have a small aquarium air pump that's hooked to this piece of aquarium air hose that runs down to a bubbler in the bottom of the tank. The purpose of that is to knock minor hydrogen bubbles off the parts as they're being nickel plated. It tends to make a better finish if you have the bubbler running while you're nickel plating. Our nickel plating setup itself consists of a number of electrical components. First we have a regular car battery charger that's capable of charging in both 6 and 12 volts. We have it set on the 6 volt setting. Next we have a 6 volt car battery. We run the battery charger continuously during the plating process to keep the battery fully charged. We run the white wire to the positive terminal on the battery through 6 miniature light bulb sockets up on this board, through an ammeter, and across this voltmeter, and over to our sheet of nickel that's our anode. We run the black wire from the positive terminal of the battery across the voltmeter and to this piece of copper tube, which becomes our cathode. When we hang parts in the tank, we suspend them with a short length of wire. When the wire touches the copper tube, it completes the circuit. We have close to 40 parts that we need to nickel plate. We have many of these long rods that are used as trailing links or leading links on the car. We'll have to nickel plate them by having tanks that we made out of wallpaper trays, and we're going to do that last. We also have quite a few short parts that'll fit in these buckets. That's what we're going to do right now. And we have some very unusual shaped parts, such as this A-arm, that won't fit in a wallpaper tray and won't fit in one of our buckets. So we'll have to get a plastic box that's big enough to hold that part so we can plate it. So right now we're going to plate all the parts that can fit in any of these buckets. And we're going to do that now. This is one of the first parts that we're going to nickel plate. It's the top link to the rear suspension. We built this last season on Vintage Garage. Now this part is a piece of chrome moly tubing and it's never had nickel plating on it. So our first step is to use pickle number 2 to treat the part. It's got a little bit of surface rust on it and we want to etch it some. So let's do that now. We'll start by screwing an old bolt into the end of it to give us something to hang on to. We don't want to touch the part once we've got it all clean. We want to go straight from the pickle into the nickel plating tank. I've soaked this paper towel in lacquer thinner and I'm wiping the part very well to remove any kind of fingerprints or other grease that might be on it. I'll then wrap this piece of electrical wire around the end of the bolt. Again, this pickle is hydrochloric acid, and we only want to leave the part in there for about 20 seconds. While that's working, we want to do the one for the other side. It's an identical part, same length, same threads. If you'd like to learn more about plating or get the details on the circuitry or the solutions we're using, you can check out caswellplating.com. We'll wipe it down good with lacquer thinner to remove any fingerprints or anything else. And we'll hang that in the side of the tank. Let's pull out our other one and see what it looks like. You can see that it's taken on kind of a gray color. The acid has completely cleaned all the rust off the part. It's almost ready to plate. We'll wipe the residue off with a little bit of thinner and we'll give it a little more time in the pickle. This one looks ready to go. I'm going to go over to our nickel plating bath and we're going to set that in here so that it's just submerged. We'll also start our air pump going to get our stream of bubbles started. Let's go over here and have a look at exactly what we have. Now let's go over and get our other part. It's all ready too, it's nice and clean. I'm going to set it on the bar. We have to make that a little longer so that it's fully submerged. And now it is. We see that we have room for a number of other parts. So we're going to do a few more parts, none of which have ever had nickel plate on them. So the procedure will be exactly the same. We'll set them in the pickle for a while, about a minute, clean them up real nice, and then we'll put them in the plating bath. We had to take this over to the power wire brush and clean it up a little bit, and then we put it in pickle number 2 to etch it and to remove any of the remaining rust. So we'll hang that over there. This is part of the shift linkage that we made in the last episode of Vintage Garage last season. We brazed on this U-joint in that episode using the jet flux system, and now we're going to add it to the nickel plate tank. Have to be very careful that none of the parts are touching each other. Lastly, we're going to nickel plate these two little tubes. They're part of the rear suspension. We'll make sure that they're submerged. Have to make that wire a little bit longer. Hang that one in there and put this one over here at a little bit of an angle. Okay, now we're ready to turn on the electricity and begin the plating. To start the process, we plug in the battery charger and we hook the white wire to the battery with just the clip for the charger. Our gauge down on the front of the battery charger indicates that it's charging. Up on our circuit board, all our lamps are lit. Our ammeter is reading about the right amperage. And our voltmeter is reading 2 volts. That's just about right for this plating operation. So now our plating is underway, and we have about an hour to wait. So we'll turn off the camera now and we'll come back in about an hour. It's now been an hour since we started the current flowing through our parts. Let's stop the current now and have a look at what we've got. I'll disconnect the anode from the battery, and I'll unplug the air supply so that we can have a little bit of quiet and see what we're doing. But we'll leave the heater running in the tank since we're going to plate some more parts. And we also leave the battery charger going so that the battery continues to charge up. But let's see what we've got. We use a little bit of paper towel to dry off the parts as we take them out. First part was one of our top links for the rear suspension. And it came out beautifully. It's all nickel plated now and nice and shiny. And our last part is the end of our steering column. And that part came out great. It's got a nice nickel finish and we're real pleased with the job. We made a pair of brand new half shafts for the car and we're going to plate them next. We also have 4 of these top link plates that have never been plated. We'll clean them up and plate them too. It's now several hours later and we're continuing to plate parts. We have about a half dozen small parts in the plating tank plating away. You should be able to hear the bubbler working in the background. And in the foreground, we're putting the parts as we take them out of the plating tank into this box with a piece of paper towel on the bottom. After we wipe them down, we spray them with WD-40 just to prevent any kind of corrosion or anything else, just to keep them nice and lubricated for when we get around to using them. This part is the front of the gear shift rod, and it was nickel plated at the Titan factory in St. Neots, England, when the car was being manufactured in the middle 70s. Still has much of its original plating, but it's dull and there's also pits in it. There's a little rust spot right there, a few pits up in here, and we want to nickel plate that all over again. So we want to make 2 treatments. The first is we're going to put it in pickle number 3, to remove much of the nickel and to etch the rest of the nickel so that our new nickel plate gets a good grip on the part. Then we'll briefly dip it in pickle number 2, the hydrochloric acid pickle, to remove the little bit of surface rust that's on the part. So we'll start that process now. We're just going to use alligator clips to rig up pickle number 3. We're going to clip one end of this to the cathode connection on this tank. This becomes the negative terminal in this bath. The other alligator clip we're just going to put on the part. We're going to dangle a part in the sulfuric acid solution. Just let it hang by the alligator clip. This is a little tough on the alligator clip. And we'll clip the other end to this wire here. You can see the lights get brighter and the voltage drops when we do that. We're actually using our same power supply now to plate nickel in this tank and deplate nickel in this tank, which has the sulfuric acid in it. And now some of the nickel plate has been removed and the rest has been etched so that we can apply a fresh coat of nickel to that part. In order to plate that, we simply go over to the plating tank and put it in and let our wire touch the bar of the plating tank. And now the nickel plating begins on that part. We've loaded up the tank with more parts, and while they're plating, we'll head up to Lincoln Speedway near Hanover, Pennsylvania. The ARDC midgets are in town tonight. It should be a lot of fun. We're up at Lincoln Speedway now and the skies are getting dark. The first thing we spot as we enter the pits is this nice step van pulling a sprint car and an open trailer. We're especially envious of the observation platform up top. It looks like something we might build and wins our Vintage Garage Transporter of the Meet Award. This is the Chevy 2 Stealth Midget of Brian Succi. The 09 belongs to Scott Lawrence. The red number 25 is the Snyder Engine Beast of Dwayne Musteller. Next door is the yellow number 72 Gertie Engine Stealth Chassis of Kathy Kurtz.
ARDC midget drivers, mandatory meeting for you getting underway in moments, right under the speakers in the outer pit area.
At the drivers' meeting, drivers draw for starting positions.
108.
There have been a lot of improvements to the track over the winter, and Lincoln Speedway official Galen Culler outlines the new procedures for the drivers.
Back out, push trucks will be coming down to pick you up. We're going to push you out this gate right down here. Once you get on the track, set the car up to fire, they'll push you off, fire it.
ARDC official Denny Lauer outlines additional procedures.
And heat races will start at 7. ARDC will be first. We only got 19 cars. With the weather, we're going to do 2 heat races, 8 laps. Top 6 will be handicapped.
Back in the pits, crew chiefs are doing last-minute prep on their cars. Last year's ARDC champion Ray Bull poses for photos in front of his Brayton Engine Beast, and we get a chance to look over the number 28 with its engine cover off.
Yeah, it's the old Chevy 2s like they used to run. Only this one's trumped up a little bit higher. It's actually a Merc Cruiser block and a Merc Cruiser head.
Next door is the number 75 Pontiac Hawk of Fred Schell. This is one of our favorite cars. Tell me something about the motor in the car.
It's a Pontiac, aluminum version of the iron tube, 166 cubic inch. It's fuel injected.
There's a slight drizzle in the air as the midgets take to the track to get heat in the motors. Each car makes a single lap to warm up the motor and then comes in off the track. Before the session ends, it begins to rain heavily and the cars head to the pits to wait out the rain. After a half hour, the skies brighten and the cars head back out onto the track along with the push trucks to try to dry out the track. begins once again, and the cars and drivers again return to the pits. It gives us a chance to interview Ed Steinley Jr., one of the top drivers.
My name's Ed Steinley Jr. I'm the driver of the Yetter number 6 ARDC midget. This is Howard Yetter, the owner. We've been in the midget races for 6 years now. Won the championship in '96, Rookie of the Year in '95. It has a 165 cubic inch fuel injected motor. The chassis is a Creek chassis, which is made out in Indianapolis. The front suspension here is a coil over. 90% of the people run the coil over in the front. They're lighter, they react quicker to this type of car. On the back of the car here, we run a torsion bar suspension. We like the torsion on our car because they're more adaptable for every kind of track you run on. Here we run a straight rear tire that measures 84 inches, and over here we run a 74 circumference, which is 10 inches on stagger, which that lets the car roll into the corner a lot easier.
The rain continues off and on, heavy at times, as the drivers check over their cars. At the north end of the pits, the bigger sprint cars are also sidelined. Finally, after an hour delay, the rain becomes steady, the evening's races are postponed, and the crews load up and head home. We had a great time, though, and look forward to the midgets' return to Lincoln. It's now Sunday, and we have time for one more project this week. We want to pull the motor in the Lola T492 and freshen it up. At VIR in Savannah, we seem to be down on horsepower, and worse, we filled up our oil catch tank every session. We need to pull the motor apart, troubleshoot it, and fix what's wrong. We've moved the Lola into one of the back bays, underneath the hook in the ceiling, so that we can start pulling the engine on the car. The first step is to get one end of the cable pull through the ring on the ceiling and fasten the other end of the cable pull to a chain that's affixed to the motor, so that we can lift the whole back of the car and block it up. We first remove the fuel line connection to the carburetor, then the throttle linkage and the radiator cross tube, and then the intake manifold and carburetor. We suspend the motor by a chain connected to the cable pull, which is hooked to the eyelet in the ceiling. We unbolt the rear chassis section and carefully lever it back to the rear. Once it separates from the main chassis, we roll the main chassis out from under the motor, leaving the motor, gearbox, and rear chassis behind. Next, we remove the oil lines that connect the dry sump pump to the oil cooler, which is mounted on the rear chassis. We then unbolt the clutch bell housing from both the motor and the gearbox. One of the studs in the bell housing has stripped its threads, and we want to repair it at the same time. We can then pull the motor away from the gearbox. We'll remove the bell housing and starter and set them aside. We winch the motor up a few feet until we can slide our bench underneath it. Once the bench is in place, we carefully lower the motor, completing the job of engine removal. Next week on Vintage Garage, we'll begin the job of rebuilding it. That's it for this week at Vintage Garage. We had a great week and got a lot accomplished. First, we got a good start on nickel plating all the parts on the Titan Mk9. Then we took a trip to Lincoln Speedway, and it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, Mother Nature now has a good lead in the ARDC points race for the season. Lastly, the Lola motor is on the bench where we can have a look at it. Next week, we have another full show. First, we'll pull the Lola motor apart and see what's wrong with it. Then we'll follow the ARDC midgets up to Silver Spring Speedway to try again to see them race. We hope for better weather this time. Lastly, we'll construct a new in-car video system to improve the quality of our in-car footage for the show. So until next time, thanks for coming. Keep the shiny side up. We'll see you next week. Information about any of the projects we've worked on today, please visit our website at www.vintagegarage.com. There's a link to our email address on the website. Please email us. We'd like to hear from you. Till next time, keep the shiny side up. Thanks for coming. See you next week.